Hello class, this is Ma'am Jal again, your creative nonfiction teacher for this semester. So we are now in our second week of our modular learning, and I hope that just like last week, you have already answered the previous questions on your modules before you proceed with this video. So last week, we discussed about themes. So we learned that the theme is the universal message that the author is trying to convey. We also learned the difference between a theme, a moral lesson, main idea, and the topic of the story. With this in mind, I guess we can now proceed with our next lesson. So for Creative Nonfiction Quarter 1, Week 2, we will learn how to create samples of different literary elements. So before we proceed with our discussion, let me first give you our main learning objectives. So at the end of this lesson, this lesson actually aims to assist the learners to be able to utilize knowledge and familiarity of the different literary elements in developing a coherent and definite written output. Now, literary elements. Main question here is, what is a literary element? Let us try to define a literary elements by using these two words, literary and element. So what do we mean when we say literary? So when we say literary, this is anything about literature or stories. On the other hand, when I say element, this is a part of something. Combining these two, we can say that a literary element is a part of a story. So let me give you a more concrete definition of literary elements. Literary elements are the things that take note, that all literature, whether it's a news article, a book, or a poem, absolutely have to have. This is a must for every writer. So every time they try to create a literary piece, they must include these literary elements. So these are the fundamental building blocks of writing, and they play an important role in helping us write, read, and understand literature. Let's try to compare it with a house. Okay, so just like a house, the elements might be arranged slightly different. Different author, different approaches. But at the end of the day, they are usually all present and accounted for. Different authors have different techniques in writing their own stories. But if you look at their stories or their novels or their book, you can see that all these literary elements are present, but they are slightly arranged in a different manner. Now, let us proceed with the different literary elements. So when you were in grade 11, your teacher in creative writing already taught you these 5 literary elements. Actually, more than 5 basic literary elements, but then we're going to focus on these 5 because these are the 5 elements that must always be present on your literary piece. So let's start with the first one. We have characters. So the characters are the subject, people, animals that the author writes about. Meaning they give life to your story. They are the ones who speak the dialogue. They are the one who's moving on your story. The second element is the theme. Last week we defined theme, and we learned that the theme is the lesson or the message to take out of the story. So example is, true friendship can get you through anything. So it's the main message of the story. Next element is, of course, the plot. So the plot are series of events in the stories. And the plot have 5 parts, starting from the exposition, which introduces the important background information of your story. It's the beginning of your story. Followed by rising action. These are series of conflicts or problems that the character or the main character encounters. Followed by the climax, which is the turning point of the story, the most important part of your story. Next is we have the falling action. This is where the conflicts has been resolved. And lastly is we have the resolution or the ending part of your story. It's the final closing of your story. So if you follow this one, we can create a good story. So starting from your exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, down to your resolution. Next is we have the setting. The setting basically answers the question when and where the story takes place. Say for example, Harry Potter takes place at Hogwarts, at Diagon Alley, at platforms 9 and 3/4. So when we say settings, not just the place, remember, it's not just the place, but also it is the time where the story took place. So last literary elements that we have is conflict. So when we say conflict, this is the main problem that the character faces. These are the problems that he needs to resolve. So, for example, Harry Potter. So, based from the story, it has many conflicts actually. It could be man versus man or Harry Potter versus Lord Voldemort, man versus animals, Harry Potter versus a dragon creature, or Harry Potter versus himself. So, it's a conflict when you say man versus man. The character is trying to fight his own feelings. The character is trying to convince himself to do what is right. So, let's have a review. What are the 5 basic literary elements? So, we'll start with the character. Then we have the theme. Then we have the plot, the setting, and then the conflicts. Now, let us move on with literary devices. What do you think is the difference between a literary element and a literary device? So later on, at the end of our discussion, I'm going to explain or I'm going to show you the difference between the two. So before I give the difference, let us first try to define literary devices. So when we say basic question again, what is a literary device? So let us try to define it by using the word literary and device. A literary, again, sorry for that. Okay, it's about literature or stories. That's what we mean when I say literary. And when I say device, it is a thing made or adopted for a particular purpose. So take note, it is adopted for a particular purpose. Therefore, we can say that a literary device is any linguistic technique that produces a specific effect in writing. In other words, when you say literary devices, these are the added features on your literary piece. So let us define it further. When you say literary devices, okay, these are understood as construction in the text, deliberately used by the writer, usually in an attempt to create some kind of artistic meaning in the piece. Another definition is that it is actually the technique a writer uses to produce a special effect in their writing. So just like what I've said a while ago, when you say literary devices, these are the added elements on your literary piece. So the 5 elements that we discussed a while ago, those are the must. Hindi pwedeng mawala. When you say literary devices, these are the special effects that you uses to make your literary piece more artistic, to make your literary piece more attractive to your audience. So what are these literary devices? Let's start with the first one. We have allusion. So when we say allusion, this is a literary device that references a person, place, thing, or event in the real world. You can use this to paint a clear picture or to even connect with your readers. So let me explain it to you by giving you an example. Okay. Careful now, you don't want to go opening the Pandora's box. So what's the allusion there? So we have there Pandora's box. Why? Because this is a reference to a real life element. It is considered therefore as an allusion. Remember that the Pandora's box is from the Greek mythology. It's a fictional thing. Now, if you use that fictional thing as a reference to your writing, therefore, you're already trying to create your own allusion. Another example, he was a real good guy, ballbuster, the Deadpool of his time. Now, what is the allusion here? It is Deadpool. So the narrator is using Deadpool as the allusion by referencing the person they're describing as being like the superhero Deadpool. So you use Deadpool to describe that person. So another example is he might be the young Rizal of his generation. So what's the allusion there? We have Rizal. So when you say Rizal, okay, what are the different, maybe the characteristics of our hero, Dr. Jose Rizal, is found on that person. Therefore, in order for you to show those characteristics, you use that word Rizal as a reference to that person main characteristic. Next, we have diction. So when we say diction, it is a literary device that's the choice of words or style used by the writer in order to convey their message. It is the way in which the author wants to write to a specific audience. So when we say diction, okay, these are the choice of words that the author uses depending on his audience. So we have different types of diction, starting from formal diction. So when you say formal diction, this is when the word choice is more formal or high class. Oftentimes, writers use formal diction as a literary device when more educated individuals are speaking or the content is for those with higher education. So you use formal diction when your readers are highly educated. Next is we have informal diction. When your characters are speaking directly to everyday people, this type of diction would be used as it is more conversational. When I say informal diction, this is the most common. It's our day-to-day language. So when you read novels, when you read books, the diction that they use most of the time is informal diction because this is our day-to-day language. Next is we have slang. So slang is commonly used for a younger audience. These are newly created words from our younger audience. And lastly, we have colloquial diction. So this is when words that are used in everyday lives are written. So this may be different depending on the culture or religions present in the writing. So let me define it to you, or let me discuss it to you further by giving you again examples. So diction example number 1, I bid you adieu. So when you say I bid you adieu, the diction present here is formal diction, as most people don't use the word bid and adieu regularly in everyday speech. So it's a formal diction because that these two words bid and adieu are not usually used by people. So these are seldom used by people. Next is we have she remembered her hair in particular because it was on flick. Now, this is an example of a slang term, the word flick. So it's used to describe a woman's hair, which means it is a slang diction. It's a newly created word by younger people or younger generation. Next example is nice ride, dude. So the diction used here is colloquial because ride here is not used as a verb, but rather it is used as a noun. So just like how Filipino use this word as a reference to a car. So don't confuse yourself with slang and colloquial because when I say slang, these are actually newly created words. So flick, low-key. So those are examples of slang words that are created by our younger generation. When I say colloquial, these are words that is already existing but are used by different or as a reference to another things by another people. For example is ride, petmalu, chikot. So those are examples actually of a colloquial diction. Next, we have alliteration. So when we say alliteration, this is a literary device that uses the same letters or sounds at the beginning of a word in a sentence or title. So the word alliterations come from the Latin word latera, meaning letters of the alphabet. So let me give you an example. So we have Philip's feet. Philip's feet is an example of an alliteration because the sounds are the same. So remember our definition. It is a literary device that uses the same letters or sound at the beginning of the word. It could be the letter or the sound. So in this case, Philip's feet, okay, is an example of alliteration because they sound the same. On the other hand, the word cheerful cup is not an example of alliteration because it might begin with the same letters, but take note, okay, an alliteration must have the same sound. So when we say cheerful cup, it does not have the same sound. So therefore, it's not an example of an alliteration. So some other examples of alliteration is Ali likes alliterations, or Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled pepper, or Sally sells seashells by the seashores, or other, what do you call this one? Tongue twisters that you're all familiar with are examples of alliterations. So next is we have allegory. So when we say allegory, this is a figure of speech where abstract ideas are described using characters, events, or other elements. Instead of being literal with an idea, you use the characters, events, or other elements in order to describe it in a way the reader can understand it better. So for example, the most famous works using allegory is George Orwell's The Farm. So this perceives the story, or the perceived stories about a story of farm animals who rise up and defeat humans but the underlying stories about the Russian Revolution. So instead of making it literal, instead of George Orwell creating a novel about Russian Revolution where he uses human being as the character, he uses animals as his reference to the Russian Revolution. So using allegory is often telling a darker story in a way that's easier to understand for the readers to receive. So example number 2 is we have Jose Rizal's No Limitangere and El Filibusterismo. Actually, this is a good example of allegory. So in his novel No Limitangere and El Filibusterismo, Rizal wrote about the current situation of the Philippines during the Spanish era. He uses Maria Clara as an epitome of a Filipino woman. He uses Crisostomo Ibarra as someone very Filipino-like. He uses Padre Damaso to describe the friars during that time. So the characters he uses in the stories may be fictional, but the story itself, tells something dark. So actually, because of this story, during that time, people started revolution. The story started revolution. Take note, when you say allegory, it's often telling a darker story. So Rizal, in his novel, wrote the dark side of the Philippines, or the dark side story of the Philippines through his novel. And because of this, when the Filipino read about his stories, there's this sparks in them that says that there must be a revolution. Next is we have flashbacks. So when you say flashbacks, these are when the narrators goes back in time for a specific scene or chapter in order to give more context for the story. So the character may travel from present to past. So it's just like giving the side story of the character by looking back on what happened at the past or during the past. So for example, oftentimes we see flashbacks in books where the past greatly impacts the present, or as a way to start a story of an interesting note. So this is seen in Harry Potter whenever Harry gets to see a memory of the past from Dumbledore or even Snape. From in Harry Potter Chamber of Secrets, Harry Potter learned the backstory of Tom Riddle, aka Lord Voldemort, through flashbacks. So foreshadowing is the opposite of flashback. So If flashbacks, traveling sa past. When we say foreshadowing, you are traveling to the future. So it's when the author places elements within the writing that gives clues about what will happen in the future of the story. This can be often be small bits and pieces that some readers might not pick up on the first read through. They might even look back and realize that certain elements were foreshadowing once they hit the climax or a big plot twist that was revealed. So actually, these are clues that the writer uses to give hints to his reader that something will happen sa future. So example, okay, in Back to the Future, one of the clocks in the opening credits has actor Harold Lloyd from the silent film Safety First hanging from the minute hand. So this foreshadows Doc Brown hanging from the Hill Valley clock tower later in the movies as he tried to send Marty McFly back to the 1980s. So, if you have watched the movie Back to the Future, the author and the director, of course, already gave you a clue on what will happen on the future. So another example is from the Avengers. So Tony Stark makes a comment about one of the ship's engineer playing a game called Galaga as they all get together for the first time. So the objective of the game in real life is to defend Earth from alien invaders. So which is what happens later in the movie. So hint there, okay, someone is playing Galaga, the game Galaga, and then at the end of the story, we learn that the Avengers or the final antagonists from the movie Avengers are aliens. So they're fighting alien invaders. Next is we have imagery. So when we say imagery, it is when you use visually descriptive or figurative language in your writing. So they think of it more like showing versus telling in writing, where you use more sensory languages versus blunt, plain words. When you use imagery, the writer is trying to paint an object. Okay, the writer is trying to create a picture, a vivid picture of the scenario on the reader's mind using words. Say for example, okay, so great uncle Algie came round for dinner and he was hanging me out of an upstairs window by my uncle's when my great auntie Enid offered him a meringue and he accidentally let go. But I bounced all the way down to the garden and into the road. They were all really pleased. Gran was crying. She was so happy. So this is from Harry Potter. Okay, so no one can deny J.K. Rowling a mastery of imagery. She created entire worlds that burst off the pages. In this example from the Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stones, Neville is describing the first time he performed magic. So we travel with him through his extreme scene, from his dangling out of a window to his joy in pleasing his family members. So technically, when we say imagery, you're just trying to create an image. Okay, a clear image on your reader mind through the use of words. Next is we have juxtaposition. So when you say juxtaposition, this means placing contrasting elements next to one another in order to emphasize one or both, including words, scenes, or themes. Example: it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. See, contradicting best, worst. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. We have foolishness and wisdom. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. Again, contradicting. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. This is an example of juxtaposition because the writer here, okay, gives two contradicting words to give emphasis to what he is trying to say. Other example is, okay, I hate loving you. The word hate and loving. Another example is, you will soon be asked to do great violence in the cause of good. See? Violence, good. So, ito yung mga, when you say juxtaposition, ito yung technique ng mga writers na kung saan akala natin happy na, tapos bigla nilang babawiin. So, most of the time, you're watching a teleserye or you're reading a book wherein akala mo, yun na yun. That's it. They're already happy, but then there will be a plot twist wherein something bad, really, really bad will happen. Okay, that's juxtaposition. So, kung baga pasisiyahin ka muna, tas bigla ka na lang from the top na okay yung nabasa mo, tas bigla na lang bababa yung emotion mo because something, the writer wrote something that gives a very big impact on the story. Next is we have symbolism. So, symbolism is the use of situation or elements to represent a larger message, idea, or concept. The use of thing as a symbol. Example is when you see a crow, okay, this usually symbolizes bad omens like death. On the other hand, the dove is used, okay, to symbolize peace. Okay, the color purple symbolizes royalty. The color red symbolizes death, struggle, power, passion. The color black symbolizes darkness, and so on and so forth. Next is tone. So when we say tone, okay, this is something that conveys the narrator's opinions, attitude, or feeling about what is written. So the literary device has the power to shape the entire narrative. So, example, and the trees all died. They were orange trees. I don't know why they died. They just died. Something wrong with the soil possibly, or maybe the stuff we got from the nursery wasn't the best. We complain about it. So we've got 30 kids there. Each kid has his or her own little tree to plant, and we've got these 30 dead trees. All these kids looking at these little brown sticks, it was depressing. Okay. So, consider the tone of the school by Donald Barthelham. So here, words like death and depressing set a negative or unhappy tone. So, another example. This was the last fish we were ever to see Paul catch. My father and I talk about this moment several times later, and whatever our other feelings, we always felt it is fitting that when we saw him catch his last fish, we never saw the fish but only the artistry of this fisherman. So, in A River Runs Through, okay, Norman MacLean loss is also addressed with a kind of acceptance. So the tone here is wistful yet peaceful and moving towards acceptance nonetheless. So actually when you say tone, it sets the mood. It sets the emotion that the writers wants you to feel when you are reading the story. Yun lang yun. When you say the tone, okay, this sets the mood. This sets the emotion that the writer wants you to feel. And how can he set this mood? By use of or through his words. Next. Okay, I know we are all familiar with this one, personification. It's a literary device where you give human-like qualities to non-human elements. So this is one of the most well-known literary device, and it's useful for a number of reasons. First, it creates a stronger visual. Second, it puts readers further into your world. Next, it helps the readers relate to and understand what's going on. Another is that it can allow readers to have a new perspective. Okay, you can give readers a new view on a typical visual or occurrences. So, example of personification. So, the wind whistled past my ears like a familiar tune I'd long forgotten. So, personification because the wind cannot whistle, but whistle is a characteristic where a human being can do or a certain person can do. So, like this, when you say personification, the things that human can do, okay, you give it to things that cannot move. That's personification. You make them move. You make them look as if they are a person. So another example, the moon yanked a blanket of silver light light over the forest. The moon is a thing, okay, but it cannot yank. A person can yank. So therefore, this is an example of a personification. Another example, squatting in the corner was a felt chair covered in the dust and dump of abandonment. Okay? Again, squatting is a characteristic of a person, but a chair is not a living thing. But using this sentence, you try to make it as if it can squat. Therefore, it's an example of personification. Next is we have onomatopoeia. So when we say onomatopoeia, this is a word or phrase that shows you the sound something makes. So since we can hear books, the literary device is best used to paint a clear picture and includes the sense of hearing in your writing. So when we say onomatopoeia, this is more on sound. So when using these literary elements in writing, remember this one. The correct formatting is almost always to have the word italicized to show emphasis of the sound. Example, I was just beginning to yawn when the nerves thinking he was trying to make a fool of me when I knew his tataratat at the door. So, the word there, the onomatopoeia used here is the word tataratat. Okay, so, some authors loves to create new words. Both William Shakespeare and James Joyce were well known for doing so. In this excerpt from his famous dense novel, Joyce created a nonce word tataratat for the sound of knocking at a door. So a nouns word is a word that is created only for special cases. So he combines other onomatopoetic words for knocking at a door like a rope and a top into one long word. After Joyce created this word, it's now listed in the longest palindrome in the English language. So when you say onomatopoeia, that's more on the sounds, unique sounds that the writer creates in his story in order for you, as the reader, hear what he's trying to say. Actually, it added additional effects on his writing. Last is we have simile and metaphor. So simile are comparison between two things that are not like and replaces the words with another word but uses like or as within it. While a metaphor is a comparison between two things that are not alike and replaces the word with another word. So like this, when we say simile, it uses the word like or as. When we say metaphor, it's direct comparison. Okay? Both simile and metaphor tries to compare two different things. But, okay, direct comparison is used in metaphor. For example, she was drowning in a sea of her own despair. This is a metaphor. Direct comparison. Simile, it was like she was drowning in a sea of her own despair. So looking at the difference of the two, okay, the first example does not use the word like. The second example uses the word like. So it's an example of a simile. Next is, his heart was weighed down by the memory of what he had done. Next example, his heart was as heavy as lead, weighed down by the memory of what he'd done. So looking at the two examples, okay, the first one does not use the word as. He directly compare his heart with a lead. Okay, while on the second example, the simile, the comparison uses the word as. Okay, so that's it. Those are the different literary devices, common literary devices used by the authors. Now, just like what I've said, I promised a while ago, I'm going to show you the difference between literary elements and literary devices. So when we say literary elements, these are components of a literary works. These are the must. Hindi pwedeng mawala. So, these are the main components of a story. What are these main components again? We have the character, the setting, the plot, the theme, and the conflicts. Okay, so for what is missing, you cannot create a good story. Next is literary device. So when you say literary device, these are, or devices, these are employed by the author to produce an effect. So actually, when you say devices, these are added components to spice up the story. The story can move on without these devices, but with these devices, your story will be more interesting and attractive and artistic, so that your audience will be attracted to read your stories. So again, literary elements, these are the must. Kailangan, hindi pwedeng mawala. Pag kulang ang isa, hindi ka makakabuo ng story. When I say devices, these are added feature of your stories. So examples are allusion, diction, alliteration, allegories, flashbacks, foreshadowing, imagery, juxtaposition, symbolism, tone, personification, onomatopoeia, simile, metaphor, etc. Okay, so that's it. So those are the different literary elements and devices that we have in creative non-fiction. So that's it for our second session. I hope that you have learned a lot. See you again next week. #handang isip, handang bukas, tara, ML na tayo.